And Alvin Karpis, in the course of time, landed a job as the first convict clerk at Alcatraz. Sentenced to life imprisonment for conspiracy to kidnap wealthy St. Paul brewer William Ham, Jr., his central file also lists 15 bank robberies, 2 kidnappings, 4 murders, and 3 jailbreaks. Larry O'Brien's criticism of these and others is somewhat severe. Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz, receives his share of attention.
I don't know what a psychiatrist would have said about Stroud, but believe me, I wanted nothing to do with him. I know of others that I considered incorrigible. Kelly, Bailey, Bates, Karpis, I felt would in time come around. Karpis, apparently at least, didn't have the hatred for everybody that wore a badge, though he did hate some of them about as much as anybody can be hated. However, I worked with Karpis quite a while, and we established a pretty good relationship.
Karpis had been one of the last of the most wanted criminals of his time to fall. Thus, when he arrived at Alcatraz, he found himself among many of his old acquaintances from the outside. An illustrious circle it was.
There was at least a dozen that I'd run around with at one time or another. You know, there was Machine Gun Kelly and Bates, Holden and Keating, Harvey Bailey. See, there was several more there that I had known at one time or another outside.
Smarter than the rest, he knew that survival came first in the order of importance, and survive he did, even though he was facing a sure 15 years on the rock before becoming eligible for parole. He was not to be allowed parole and would serve an additional 18 years before his release and deportation in 1969. 33 years in all. But Karpis, probably the most notorious of all the bad men of his period, is alive, well and prosperous. He lives in Montreal and recently has written a book. His view on Alcatraz and the American policy of correction are pungent, tough-minded, and unforgettable. Bank robber and kidnapper Alvin Karpis, sometimes known to another generation of Americana as Old Creepy, obtained his freedom in 1969. He now lives here in Montreal, Canada, after having lived and survived 26 years on the rock, plus another 7 years at McNeil Island in the state of Washington. Born Francis Alvin Karpis, August 10, 1908 in Montreal, he moved with his parents to Topeka, Kansas before he was of school age. Later, he sold newspapers in the sleazier part of town, and by age 10, his associations had afforded him a liberal knowledge of the half-world of petty crime, pimps, and prostitutes. Already he'd been in several scrapes with the law, and in the next 15 years would rob many a bank, and according to the FBI statement, kill many a man. It is probable that the only thing that would save him from eventual execution would be his apprehension and conviction by the feds. Uncle Sam's courts dole out severe penalties, but rarely execute. Thus, Alvin Karpis, ironically, benefited from the severity of his well-earned penalties. He was a member of what J. Edgar Hoover labeled the toughest gang we ever cracked. Ma Barker, alleged to have been the head of that gang, finally, along with her younger son Freddie, was machine-gunned to death in their Florida hideout. Alvin Karpis was absent at the time, but his career also terminated shortly thereafter in New Orleans. According to official reports of the period, he was the only fugitive ever personally busted by Mr. Hoover. Karpis's version of his downfall is a little different.
Well, all I can say about this is that if that version of my arrest is any criteria, you know, as to the rest of the contents of this book, oh boy, they should put it right on a shelf for fairy tales, because that's what that book is about. If it's no more accurate, the rest of it, than the way they describe my capture in New Orleans.
This high-voltage criminal and leading gangland figure of the Prohibition era is now a respectable and respected citizen of Montreal. But when he was sent to Alcatraz in the fall of 1936, his stay there was to encompass almost the entire history of the Rock in its function as the most maximum of maximum security prisons. His views, in retrospect, are pungent. His reactions as strong and traumatic as on the wet, bleak, foggy morning he arrived on the Rock.
It's hard to explain that to you. Every guy, when he gets in prison, you don't think he's going to stay there long. Something will happen. But in my case, I wasn't kidding myself. The only thing I had going for me there, every year they'd talk about breaking the place up, you know, doing away with it. Well, that kind of kept things going. I didn't think I'd want to try to escape from there. It was just too tough. And I thought, well, if we get transferred, they break the place up, I have a little better shot at it. So over the years, you keep going like that. One thing will give you a little hope in this direction, another one will knock it out, and then something else will occur, and you say, well, maybe. But actually, it was not until 1955 that I even thought I had a ghost of a chance about anything, and only then because the man that came back there is a warden, and he was a fairly decent sort of a guy for a job like that.
Could the Justice Department have picked a worse place?
I don't believe they could have, because as a matter of fact, they were going to establish it in southeast Alaska. On an island, the Attorney General went over and picked a site. Him and his wife were on an Army transport, and as they came back into the Golden Gate there, they seen this big sign across there, you know, U.S. Disciplinary Barracks. So he inquired around, and they wound up subleasing this thing for 5 years from the Army. But then the propaganda got so great for them, and this thing, you know, it was a big mysterious deal, you know, according to them, and it sort of took the imagination of the news media, the people, and everything, and the first thing you know, it was worth millions to them, and just in propaganda alone. And I might add at this point, it was probably the greatest fraud that was ever put off on the American people for that length of time. I think it lasted about 28 years or so, and they had the American people completely fooled. It was a real bad place, yes. But I would like to make it perfectly clear, I'm not sniveling about my treatment there or anything like that. It's just, it was so unnecessary. When you take a group of men, you deprive them of everything but the fact that they're having their meals and a place to sleep. No newspapers, no radio. Of course, there's people that will say, well, what the hell did they want? What did they get in trouble for if they don't like it? But the government had 20,000 other prisoners that they didn't treat in that manner. So, no, it wasn't necessary.
Officer O'Brien believes differently, at least in point of time.
The 20s and 30s spawned a different, brainier, more reckless, more ruthless type of criminal. He was armed with weapons, cars, and even airplanes of a much more sophisticated nature than any police department was allowed by their rather stringent budgets. Because of this, they were many times able to outperform the police. This condition eventually brought into being the FBI, the G-man of the 30s, and it also brought into being Alcatraz, as some place had to be built or found which was strong enough to hold these people, and Alcatraz was a natural. Their money, connections, ruthlessness, and viciousness made ordinary penitentiaries utterly impractical. Remember, these men all had prior records and were well known. It took an Alcatraz to hold such men, and just as importantly, to hold their gangland friends, and in some cases, their relations out. As I view the picture in retrospect, there is a great deal on the affirmative side and very little on the negative side. Probably the most negative was the financing and lack of recreation and education. But in the overall picture, in answer to the question, was Alcatraz needed? Was it a necessity? I can only answer, you're darn right it was.
Former public enemy number one, Alvin Karpis, doesn't appear overly impressed by the tough guy reputations of the residents of Alcatraz.
Well, I'll tell you what I found about Alcatraz anyway, and I think this goes for a lot of those places. Usually these guys, when they're looking for trouble, they finally run into some guy that is looking for the same thing, and when they do, something's got to give. You know, there's a lot of people killed there in Alcatraz in one manner or another, and they had the thing flooded at one time with psychotics. They should have actually been in the medical center, see, but these other prisons would recommend that they go to Alcatraz just to get them out, the guy out of their hair. So now they would wind up out there, and hell, and like I say, some of them were real paranoid, you know, and they'd walk up to a guy and say, what are you watching me for? What are you looking at me for? And things like that, and it would create a bad, tense situation around the place.
Publicity has painted Al Capone as a lonely outsider, unpopular with his fellow cons, possibly living in fear of his life.
He was all right. He was a very nice guy. I've read so many different stories about his the way he was in the prison and that he wasn't liked. Well, let's get down to it. You find a guy that everybody likes. There's something wrong with the guy himself, probably. But all in all, he was all right there, and just like he was all right before he got in prison. He did his time, and nobody ever heard him complaining or anything. And they gave him a bad way to go there because, well, just like they did me, because of the people in Washington. And nobody wanted to say that they were being easy on some guy, you know, like myself or Capone or Kelly. And
George Machine Gun Kelly was another who made many a front-page headline. Was he also easy to get along with?
Kelly, you know, he had read so much of that propaganda about himself before he was arrested. He got to believe in himself, I think, a little bit. And it would seem like he never tired of telling about all these escapades, you know. And he had lived a rather fascinating life. And the guy, the only thing he was a little inclined to talk about things that he actually hadn't did. For one time he was describing a hell of a sensational thing. I got to think, what the hell is he talking about? I was on this thing, and I don't remember him being around there, you know.
I'm a great admirer of San Francisco, which was so close to you on the Rock. Must have been painful to be so near and yet so far from all that life and gaiety.
I tell you what, they couldn't have designed a thing, you know, to make it worse for you. And oddly enough, the isolation block there, you could see San Francisco better than from the main block. The main block, you could only about 30 cells where you could sit, and they used to be choice cells. Why them guys wanted to punish themselves, I don't know. They even go to the extent we used to steal a lens out of the x-ray machine in the hospital and stuff, and the guy would grind down the lens and make telescopes. Well, you could look right in them joints over on Fisherman's Wharf with this, you know.
In spite of the rigid security on the Rock, the natural hazards of the bay, it's known that a number of men became desperate enough to risk the tremendous odds in all-out bids to escape, although most of them were recaptured or drowned. Both Officer O'Brien and Mr. Karpis recall nearly successful attempts, and one party had a chilling change of heart, thus ending the shortest escape attempt on record.
Yeah, Giles, or Giles, as I know him, was assigned to the crew that worked on the dock. And at that time, during the war, World War II, Army uniforms were sent to Alcatraz to be cleaned and repaired and laundered. Over a period of time, our friend Giles had managed to secret a uniform. Now, this uniform bore the stripes of a staff sergeant. And each time when the boat would land at the dock, the inmates were required to line up along the edge of the dock. And at this time, Giles would take advantage of the 20 or 30 seconds available to him to put a small part of the uniform underneath. So one day, the General Coxey, I believe it was, came in, which was a boat that traveled between San Francisco and Angel Island, stopping at Alcatraz. There was a provost marshal aboard. During the time the boat was tied up at the dock at Alcatraz, which was only a matter of minutes, he noticed a staff sergeant make what was known as a pierhead jump. As the boat pulled away, he said to the officer on the dock, "Who was that staff sergeant that got aboard?" And the officer said, "Staff sergeant? We have no staff sergeants on Alcatraz. We didn't put a staff sergeant on there." And after about 5 seconds thought, the officer called for an immediate emergency count. But by this time, Giles was pretty well along on his way to Angel Island. Of course, they had telephoned Angel Island, and the military police picked up Giles on his arrival. He was possibly the saddest-looking staff sergeant in history. Yeah, I knew Bayless, knew him quite well, in fact, and Bayless did attempt an escape, and it probably was the shortest escape in history. I think that the one thing that we had going for us that day was the temperature of the water, and Bayless found this out when he got in it. And when he found out how cold it was, he immediately turned and headed for the shore.
The only guy that ever made that thing, and that you might say made it, was a kid by the name of Scott. He got over out of there in the evening, right after supper time in the fog, and he was very fortunate in this respect. He didn't go out through the gate, but he got under the bridge, and you may know about this, what they call dead man's current there, that comes back alongside of the shore. He was lucky enough to get into that, and he got up on the shore there right off the Presidio, and some little kids seen him and run home and told their parents. Well, when the police got there, hell, this guy was already in a state of shock. When they got him to the hospital, his temperature was under 95. So if they hadn't picked him up, he would have died right there anyway. But that was, as far as I'm concerned, that's the closest successful escape in Alcatraz.
Did you ever consider escape?
Many, many times, yes. Matter of fact, it's no secret now, but I could have been involved in every one that attempt that occurred there while I was there. But I knew a little something about swimming, and I knew just what kind of condition I was in. And I wasn't about, if they had told me go on down there, we'll give you half a day, I wouldn't have did it, you know, I wouldn't have jumped in that water. Because the water, as you know, is ice cold, and I couldn't have made it over there.
Mr. Karpis, tell me, during that tough, endless, dreary 33 years, did you ever expect the good life you have now?
I hadn't the slightest idea it would be anything like this. As a matter of fact, when I wake up in the morning, I kind of, you might say, count my blessings in this matter and wonder, is it really happening, you know, because it's been fantastic, the treatment I've been afforded here in Montreal by everyone I've came in contact with.